Welcome, and today we are going to talk about vertebrate evolution. So, early in the Cambrian, about 530 million years ago, so for those keeping track, that's about half a billion years ago, and going with about 4.5 billion years for the age of the Earth. That means if we put that on a timeline and put it on a football field, that is about the 11-yard line. So about the 11-yard line, if you start from one end zone and go to the other, that's when we finally have vertebrates. So early in the Cambrian period, about 530 million years ago, an astonishing variety of invertebrates, animals inhabited the Earth's ocean. So actually, I misspoke there. That's the invertebrates in the ocean. So one type of animal gave rise to vertebrates, and one of the most successful groups of animals. And it depends what your definition of successful is here, because how do we define success? If you want sheer number of animals, invertebrates outnumber vertebrates by a long shot. 95% of all the organisms that are animals on this planet are invertebrates. Most of those being arthropods, and even furthermore, most of them being insects, and then being very specifically beetles. So beetles are the most successful groups in terms of sheer numbers. But when you talk about like a wide diversity and a group being highly adaptable and top of the food chain, things like that, vertebrates kind of really have some really great traits that give them some advantages. The animals called vertebrates get their name from the vertebrae, which again just means backbones, and that's where we get our name from. Now, not all vertebrates technically have backbones. Some of them have cartilage and such. You'll see on the next couple pages. But here we see an early vertebrate, and you can see the early development of what looks almost like a backbone. Could have been bone, could have been cartilage. So one lineage of vertebrates colonized the land about 365 million years ago. So we're now like around like the 7-8 yard line. And these are the vertebrates that are moving on to land, okay? And these gave rise to modern amphibians, reptiles, which include birds. You might not think of birds as being reptiles, but let me ask you this. Do birds have scales? And almost always I have a bunch of students say, no, they don't. And I said, well, what about their feet? And if you look at their feet, they do indeed have scales. Furthermore, if you look at their feathers, really mechanically they're different, but morphologically they have a lot of characteristics that are basically the same as scales. They're just scales that have grown differently, let's just think of it. So there are more than 57,000 species of vertebrates, which again pales in comparison to like the beetles, but it's still a really large and successful group, successful in terms of diversity and number of niches that they fill, including the largest organisms to live on Earth. So that's another thing, is like the largest animals to ever existed are the vertebrates. Many people think immediately, well, what are the largest animals? And they immediately think of dinosaurs. But remember, we have animals that are on this planet currently that are way more massive than the largest dinosaurs we found, and that is the blue whales. So we have some extremely large animals still alive today. Vertebrates have the great disparity and a wide range of differences within the group. So in other words, you have humans. We're very different than mice, let's say, but that's still within the same group. I mean, we're really different than reptiles, birds, frogs, fish, and yet we still consider them all in the same group. It's still all the same phylum, which is why we kind of divide this lecture into, like, we got our invertebrates, now we're talking about all the vertebrates. So the chordates, which belong to phylum Chordata, are bilateral animals, all right, that belong to a clade of animals known as Deuterostomia. And we talked about deuterostomes. The anus develops first, the mouth develops later. We have a second folding that develops the mesoderm. All that stuff that we talk about, deuterostomes and protostomes. Chordates comprise all vertebrates and two groups of invertebrates. So there's actually two invertebrates in that they don't have backbones. And those are called the urochordates and cephalochordates. So here we can see this cladogram kind of has our derived characteristics, and we can see the advancements and what are the most primitive characteristics. So here are deuterostomes. Here we have the echinoderms, really not closely related to us, but they are deuterostomes, so they have that trait in common with us. And then really, what is the basal characteristic that all of these guys, all the chordates include? Well, that's a notochord. You might say, well, what the heck's a notochord? I don't ever remember going to a doctor to see about my notochord or hearing anyone dealing with a notochord. Well, in us, it's basically replaced by our backbone. And that's where we get the vertebrae at. Now, we have jaws. We have a mineralized skeleton. Now, we don't get that in all of the vertebrates, but here you have like chondrichthyes, and they do have jaws that are mineralized. We have lungs as the next major characteristic, and we, again, see that even in some of the fish. These are our lungfish. Another trait that we can kind of see here are these lobed fins, which basically is what leads to tetrapods, where you have 4 leg-like structures. And then eventually we get up here to amphibians, and then now we have not only these lobed fins or these limbs, but now we have limbs with digits. We have what basically becomes the 5-finger rule, which is that you have pretty much 5 fingers on most organisms, or at least they have it somewhere in their development. There's a little bit of variation on that. So some animals kind of break the rules, but like, for example, spider monkeys only have 4 fingers. They don't have their thumb. And the characteristic that makes a primate is having a thumb. So kind of interesting that they don't have one, but that it's greatly reduced because it gets in the way when they're with their movement in the trees. So an amniotic egg, and yes, even humans have amnions. Think of an amniotic sac. So really, it's an egg-like structure just held internally for us. And then what makes a mammal is the production of milk. So again, we'll be reviewing this in the next slides. I kind of went through that fast, but all chordates share a set of derived characteristics, so something that they all have. And really, that's a notochord, which again gets replaced in us, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, which becomes our spinal cord and brain, pharyngeal gill slits or clefts. Now, we don't have gill slits now, but I mean, the larynx, which is what I'm using to help talk, it supports my vocal folds, is part of that pharyngeal gill slits from the embryological development. So, those are very important structures. Muscular post-anal tail. Now, again, that's going to be reduced in a lot of these guys. So here's your basic chordate. Dorsal nerve cord, a notochord, which acts as a support. All right, again, just basically a vertebrae. Post-anal tail. Again, a lot of vertebrates have tails. The ones that don't, well, they still have a tail bone. It's just the rest of their bodies kept growing when their tail just kind of stayed the same shape. The pharyngeal gill slits, again, they change as we develop, but they were there in early embryological development. So notochord, longitudinal flexible rod. So it's basically a big, long structure. And it's between the digestive tube and the nerve cord. And us, it becomes more or less the intervertebral discs between our vertebrae. It provides skeletal support throughout most of the length of the chordate. In most vertebrates, a more complex jointed skeleton develops, and the adults retain only the remnants of this embryonic notochord. Again, I mentioned like the vertebral discs. So the nerve cord of a chordate embryo develops from a plate of the ectoderm that rolls into a tube. This is like neural crest. It's this big, long tube that forms. Sometimes it's called a neural streak. And so if you look at an embryo, it gets longer. And if you just imagine a tube forming on top of a tube. So you get this other tube running the length from the top of the organism all the way to the end of it, the tip of its tail. And that tube is, if it doesn't seal all the way, that's where you get things like spinal bifida. Is basically that tube doesn't close all the way. Sorry, had to deal with a cat. All right, so nerve cord develops into the central nervous system. Basically becomes a brain and a spinal cord. One side swells and then folds in on itself. And then the rest of it just becomes our spinal cord, which is the main connection between our brain and our body. So the pharyngeal clefts develop into slits that open to the outside of the body. That's for ones that have gills. The functions, suspension feeding structures in many invertebrate chordates, gas exchanging invertebrates, except for vertebrates with limbs, the tetrapods, so anything that has basically 4 arms, they're not going to use that for gas exchange. Develop into the parts of the ear, head, neck, and tetrapods. So again, it forms a lot of the structures that make up our skull even. So chordates have a tail posterior to the anus. In humans, we have a tailbone. We just outgrow the rest of that tail. In many species, the tail is greatly reduced. Tail contains skeletal elements and muscles, so you can see those. The coccyx is a bunch of fused bones, which are the remnants of our tail. It provides propelling force in the aquatic organisms. We're not aquatic, so again, we don't need that. Lancelets, also known as cephalochordata, are named for their blade-like shape. So cephala means head, and then chordate, again, it's a head chordate. Basically, these guys are a head with a tail. That's it. No fins, no limbs, nothing like that. They have all the basic chordate characteristics, and that's as advanced as they're going to be. They are marine suspension feeders. So here we have cephalochordata. They are basal chordates. And we look here, here's their tail, there's a notochord and nerve cord, and food comes in through here, goes through these gill slits, and then food is going to go down here into the stomach. Water goes out there. This is called the antipore, so that's where the water actually gets filtered through here and goes out there. So they're going to filter out the food and oxygen, and food's going to get passed down here and go out the anus. And then we can see these segmented muscles. That's another characteristic we see in chordates. And then here you have these little barbels or almost tentacles that they use to basically grab food out of the water. And they can swim around. So tunicates are our next group. They're called Urochordata, and they're more commonly known as sea squirts. You can see down here. If you pick them up, they kind of squirt some water at you. And they're filter feeders, and a lot of scientists, they kind of think of these guys as being basal, but they're not indeed basal at all. These guys have basically they're genetically more similar to us than the last group we talked about, even though the last group looked a little bit kind of like a fish. By the way, a lance is like a pointy thing that can be used for like cutting something. So that's why they're called lancelets. In the last group, the sea squirts, also called tunicates. They're called tunicates because they produce a cellulose sac. They're the only animals that produce cellulose to help protect them. All right, so they basically are this larva for like the blink of an eye. That's it. They swim, get attached somewhere. They use a sucker to attach, and they basically grow into this thing where water's coming in here. It's using its gill to filter in the food, and also you remove some oxygen there. But then food goes out there, and then the water goes in here and out there and carries away the waste. So those are our strong filter feeders. So ancestral chordates may have resembled lancelets. Again, they're our basal group. They have similar Hox genes that organize the brain and are expressed in the lancelet's simple nerve cord tip. So basically, we sequence the tunicate genome, and it indicates that genes associated with the heart and thyroid are common to all chordates. So they have that, lancelets don't. So that's why we kind of make them a little bit more closely related to us. Genes associated with transmission of nerve impulses are unique to the vertebrates, so they have that as well. And it's these Hox genes here that we see that are in those tunicates that then we see in all vertebrates. And again, modifications on those, but basically they lead to what basically makes our forebrain and our midbrain. So this is like the main part of our brain, like the cerebrum, and this midbrain is kind of like approaching. This is what's known as the pons. For those who take anatomy and physiology, and this hindbrain here is like the brain stem part of it being the medulla oblongata. So, anyways, a skeletal system and complex nervous system have allowed vertebrate efficiency at 2 essential tasks. Basically, capturing food. I mean, imagine trying to eat food if you didn't have jaws. It would make things. I mean, it would be kind of difficult trying to eat your food, and also evading predators. Basically, you're able to escape because of more movement efficiency. So vertebrates have 2 or more sets of Hox genes. Basically, the smallest ones, we have these 2 sets. But lancelets and tunicates have only 1 cluster. After that, we have 2 sets of Hox genes, and then it just kind of keeps repeating. These Hox genes basically are what are going to help us develop a lot of these differentiated structures that we see in the vertebrates. Vertebrates have the following derived characteristics. First of all, vertebrae enclosing a spinal cord, so basically a protective layer surrounding that spinal cord, and an elaborate skull. We actually divide the higher level invertebrates based on their skull structures into three main groups. We have fin rays in the aquatic forms. Those fin rays eventually become our limbs in the lobe-finned fishes and more advanced. So fossil evidence shows that the earliest vertebrates lacked jaws. And there are only two lineages of jawless vertebrates that remain today. They are the hagfishes and the lampreys. So they do have a cartilage skeleton that kind of encapsulates and forms vertebra around that nerve cord. Remember, these groups, again, they do lack a backbone. So, they're just like barely what we would truly consider vertebrates. Presence of a rudimentary vertebrae and the results of phylogenetic analysis indicate that both hagfishes and lampreys are vertebrates. Again, just basically looking at their genetic structure and seeing that they kind of have this like almost like cartilage vertebrae surrounding that nerve cord. So together, the hagfishes and lampreys form a clade of living jawless vertebrates called the cyclostomes. Vertebrates with jaws make up a much larger clade called the gnathosomes. So just think of all the animals that you know that are vertebrates, and all the ones that have jaws, they're a gnathosome. So technically, we're gnathosomes. Gnath comes from the root word for jaw. So here we go with these two groups right here for our hagfishes and lampreys. You see slime glands here. There's actually some really cool YouTube videos of people picking up hagfishes, and they produce a ton of mucus that is really slimy snot that makes them really, really slippery. As a matter of fact, their skeletons are so flexible, you can see how they're spun around like that. They can actually tie themselves in a knot and use that to like pull themselves through that knot and then escape from you because they're so slippery. They can also use it to, since they don't have jaws for biting down, they can use this to like gnaw on something, and then they can tie that knot and then pull their jaws through that knot, and then use that to tear off flesh. Now, they can only do that really with, in the cases of hagfish, you're going to do that with like dead and decaying things like large whales and such, rotting at the bottom of the ocean. This is a lamprey, and the lampreys are actually going to use this to gnaw at the side of something and just feed on its bodily fluids. So here we can see some early vertebrates and these segmented muscles that we can see fossilized there. So mineralization appears to have originated with vertebrate mouth parts. And just think about it, like what in the mouth is mineralized? Well, our teeth, right? And so they think that maybe these were like scales that kind of moved towards the mouth. Maybe some of these gill arches started mineralizing, and that's what formed the jaws. But the jaws are really important because they give places for muscles to pull on. I mean, if your muscles aren't pulling on a jaw, just imagine one day you woke up and your lower jaw was gone, and now to clench your jaw muscles. What's it going to pull on? Really nothing, right? And so that's the whole point, is that these jaw muscles can now attach to something and give it a leverage point and make them basically really strong biters. And you might say, well, how strong could this be in these rudimentary vertebrates? Well, remember the most rudimentary gnathosomes include sharks, and sharks have an amazing bite force. And really the only bones they have in their body are their jaws. So, it's one heck of an advantage, and that's why we see most of the vertebrates being gnathosomes. Ray fin fishes, lobe fin fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, all of the above. So gnathosomes, their jaw mouth, covered that already. The jaws are hypothesized to have evolved from modification of skeletal rods that supported the pharyngeal gill slits. So if we look here, we have these gill slits which filter out water, and we have these rods that are cartilage, and some of the early ones maybe mineralized and then moved forward and then became what are these modified rods or jaws. So other characteristics common to gnathosomes, basically we see genome duplication. Basically we start seeing more and more copies of these Hox genes, and that has to do with some of those like segmented muscles, probably some of those rods being repeated. And now, if you have some of those rods being repeated, you don't necessarily need all of them. And so what we can do is modify some of them to be the jaws that then are now used for biting. An enlarged forebrain associated with the enhanced smell and vision. Sharks have an amazing sense of smell. Very small drops of blood can be sensed in the ocean water for miles away even. In aquatic gnathosomes, the lateral line system. So this is something that we talk about it, and people are like, well, this sounds really strange. So basically, there's this tube-filled organ on the sides of fish that absorb vibrations, and it allows them to sense the vibrations in water. And we're like, oh, well, that would be a cool sense to have. Well, you have that. It just manifests itself differently because we're hearing in air, and they're hearing in water. And yes, you heard me right, hearing. I mean, that's really, when you hear something, that is just vibrations in the air. So earliest gnathosomes in the fossil record are extinct lineages of armored vertebrates called placoderms. So one of the really important placoderm fossils was discovered in Ohio. This, by the way, is about 440 million years ago. So notice this is before that 365 million years ago when vertebrates moved onto land. And here you go. What a looker, right? Actually, this thing is gigantic. This thing would have been, I want to say, upwards of around 8 to 10 feet in length. It was a really, really big fish, and it's just armored plated fish. It's got this armored skull that kind of was, just gave it this massive amount of protection. These guys, the rest of it was cartilage, and you could see like its teeth is actually part of its skeleton. There's these biting serrated edges. It's thought that these guys were predators. They are all extinct now. Obviously, we haven't seen anything this frightening in the ocean before, in modern times. But I mentioned this guy was found in Ohio. The actual skeleton now resides in the Natural History Museum of the Americas in New York City, and they have a cast of this at our museum in Cleveland. So chondrichthyes are still around, though. All right, they basically just have the jaws. These are sharks, skates, and rays, and they think that their teeth are just like fossilized scales that basically are replacing themselves and give them this advantage with teeth that are replaceable. So we can see some of the traits of fish there. Sharks have streamlined bodies. They're swift swimmers. The largest sharks are actually suspension feeders, which is kind of interesting because like the largest mammals are also suspension feeders, but most sharks are carnivores. So sharks have a very short digestive tract. If you look at their intestines, it really doesn't like loop around like we see in a lot of vertebrates. Basically, you get the J shape on the stomach, and then it's just a straight tube. But they do have what's called a spiral valve, and that increases the surface area. Actually, a scientist at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History discovered that there are these fossils that were spiral-shaped, and for a long time, scientists puzzled what the heck these spiral-shaped fossils were, and it turns out they were the insides of the shark intestines. So sharks have acute senses, including sight, smell, and the ability to detect electrical fields. So I mentioned the lateral line system and how a lot of people think that would be a cool sense. Well, like I said, you have that. What we don't have is the ability to detect these electrical fields. And so what happens is that the shark in their nose, they have these, what looks like stubble, and they can actually sense electrical impulses, like even if they can't see it. Like if, for example, if something was moving on the other side of a wall, they'd be able to tell that it was there. And how do they tell that? How do they sense that? It just senses that whenever you move, it's an electrical signal. First of all, a nerve impulse, but also the muscles. I mean, your heart beating is a bunch of electrical impulses. And so these organs sense that, and they can see things because they sense their electrical signal. Now, how does that work? Again, I'm not a shark, so I can't exactly explain it to you. But the brain processes these signals from this organ like structure that's on their nose, which is part of the reason why shark noses are extremely sensitive. So shark eggs are fertilized internally, but embryos can develop in a lot of different ways. So these guys do have internal fertilization. They have modified on what are their pelvic fins. They have what are called claspers that the males use, and they kind of use it like a penis to deliver sperm during sex. But we have three major strategies, which we see in all the vertebrates from here on out. You have oviparous, which are eggs are outside the mother's body. So they the eggs hatch outside the mother's body, so they lay the eggs. We call these mermaids, purses, and sharks. But you're familiar with a lot of animals being oviparous. I mean, chickens are oviparous. Ovoviviparous, the embryo develops within the uterus and is nourished by an egg yolk, but that egg yolk dissolves and gets smaller as the baby shark gets bigger, and then it's given live birth. It's a combination of the word oviparous, meaning egg, and then viviparous, meaning live birth. So here we have egg birth, here we have live birth. This is egg and live birth. So the egg basically decreases in size as it develops. Viviparous, the embryo develops within the uterus and is nourished through a yolk sac placenta from the mother's blood. So we actually have basically almost like a placental type of thing going on here that we see in the mammals. A little different, but kind of the same idea. So the vast majority of vertebrates belong to a clade of gnathosomes called osteichthyes. Oste means bone, ichthy means fish, so these are bony fish. Nearly all living osteichthyans have a bony endoskeleton. Basically, they've got bones inside their body. Osteichthyans include the bony fish and tetrapods. So technically, we are fish. We are osteichthyans because of that common lineage. And so, yeah, we're tetrapods, and we're kind of our own group that's kind of elevated beyond these osteichthyans. But when we're talking about like the classification, basically this bony endoskeleton is the structure that's retained even all the way into us. So we share that. To be an osteichthyan, you got to have this bony endoskeleton, and they got it. So, and then pass it on to all the rest of the animals. So aquatic osteichthyans are the vertebrates we normally call fishes. Even though we call sharks a type of fish, understand that they are a different group. See, here's our chondrichthyans, and here we have our traditional fish. So most fishes breathe by drawing water over gills, and it's protected by an operculum. A lot of times what we refer to as the gill is the operculum, which is the gill cover. Fishes control buoyancy with an air sac known as a swim bladder. And this swim bladder basically inflates with air and allows them to basically go up or down in the water column. And if so basically we remove some of the air out of it, they sink down a little bit. And this is like, for a shark to swim, it's got to be moving. For a fish, it can basically kind of float there. Like sharks, if they aren't swimming, they're sinking. So fishes have a lateral line system. We mentioned that before. They still retain that. Most species are oviparous, but some have internal fertilization and birthing, like, for example, the guppies in the fish tank in my room. All right, so here we see this swim bladder. And here are some of the fish diversity. Notice the eels belong to this group. By the way, if you have like see anything ever made out of eel skin, this is not the type of eel that the eel skin's made out of. It's actually from hagfish, which look a lot like eels, but again, just like a convergent evolution thing. So you guys should be starting your coral reef book now. And so for next week, make sure you guys read at least the intro and chapter 1. I think you're supposed to get through chapter 2. It does state in the syllabus. But here we can see, so these are the corals. So those are cnidarians. But it started out showing some fish that belong to the bony fish group. So here we go. We can see them there. In a second here, it should give you a close-up. You should see, yes, here you can see some of the lateral lines right there, which again, they use kind of like their sense of hearing. All right, so lobe-finned fishes also originated in the Silurian period, and they have a muscular pelvic and pectoral fins they use to swim and walk underwater across substrate. In other words, they look kind of like they're walking. They're using their fins kind of like legs. And when you look at them, here you go, you can see kind of how they have these leg-like structures here and here. Notice that there's actually like an arm before we get to the fin out here. They had fossils of these guys for years and years and years, and they thought that these were all extinct. All lobe-finned fishes had gone away and that they were all extinct. And then they found coelacanths in the 70s. Some fishermen pulled one up out of the ocean. And since then, we found several different populations out off of the coast of Madagascar, and I want to say there's somewhere else in the world they found them. So living lungfishes are all found in the southern hemisphere. We find them in South America and Australia, and I believe Africa as well. And so they have that lobe fin structure, but they also have the ability to it says, though gills are the main organs for gas exchange, it can also surface gulp air into their lungs. So they have lungs. Now, there are other fish, bony fish, that can gulp air as well, but it's a different type of process. These guys gulp, and it actually goes in the sac that's used like a real primitive lung. They can use it to kind of get them in between times of being in water, so they can survive out of water for a substantial amount of time. The third surviving lineage of lobe fin fins are the tetrapods. So again, that's us, things with 4 legs that have moved on to land. So one of the most significant events in the vertebrate history was when the fins of some lobe fins evolved into limbs and feet of tetrapods. So we have 4 limbs, we have 2 arms and 2 legs, and feet with digits, again, typically 5. A neck, which allows separate movement of the head. If you think of a fish, its head's basically fused right to the spine. It doesn't really have a neck for movement around to the head. But on the other hand, when it's swimming, it needs to be more aerodynamic, and it's just kind of moving forward, right? Moving towards where its head's going. Fish don't really swim backwards. Not exactly. So fusion of the pelvic girdle to the backbone. So again, just having a pelvis basically. And the absence of gills, except for a few aquatic species, like for example, some species of amphibian. And then ears for detecting airborne sounds. And even amphibians have ears, even though they don't have ear bones, they have this tympanic membrane. So anyways, Tiktaalik is basically it's named fishapod is its nickname. It shows both fish and tetrapod characteristics. It has fins, fish, gills, fish, lungs. Ooh, no, wait a minute, that's a tetrapod. And scales. Well, no, that's back to a fish. Ribs to breathe and air to support, to breathe air, and then the ribs also help support its body. You can basically support it on land because you got to hold your body open to allow the lungs to fill up. And then a neck and shoulders. Again, things we see in tetrapods. Fins with the bone pattern of a tetrapod limb. So here we go. We look at this and we can see these shoulder bones. Basically, we have shoulder blades. We don't have shoulder blades like in fish. So why are these shoulder blades there? Well, it's allowing for more movement of this, like basically this arm-like structure. And notice we're starting to see like a wrist-like structure there as well. You can see like, it mentions the scales and the ribs here. All the other characteristics. It's kind of looking like an amphibian, but still got some of those fish-like characteristics because remember, amphibians don't have scales. So here we go, and notice that here we have that Tiktaalik, and then you can see some of the analogous structures here that we see now later in the later tetrapods. Notice we have this in-between version here. We basically evolution experimented with having more digits than 5. 5 was what we kind of settled on, and we kind of see that there on out in animals. So, amphibians or class amphibia are represented by about 6,150 species. Basically, we have our salamanders, our frogs, and what are known as caecilians. Think of caecilians kind of like the snakes of the amphibian world, although different kind of. These rings help them move through soil. They do live in the soil rather than slithering on the ground like a snake does. But they're only found in the tropics. These are our caecilians. Anura, basically, are frogs, and then Urodela is our salamanders. I also usually classify them as what's known as caudata. Cauda means tail. So amphibian means both ways of life. Basically, they spend part of their life in the water, part of it on land, although there's some of them that are very much just, they've gone all in back to the water. Tadpoles are herbivores that lack legs, basically, and lungs, external eardrums, but basically they eventually develop these through a metamorphosis. Most amphibians have moist skin that complements lung exchange. Basically, a lot of amphibians need to use their skin for respiration. As a matter of fact, some don't even have lungs at all anymore because they've gone all in on the breathing through the skin thing, which is why amphibians are really great indicators of how your ecosystem's doing. If you don't have very many amphibians, or you have some amphibians with some really weird mutations or they're unhealthy, that means that there's a lot of water pollution. So amniotes basically are a group of tetrapods whose living members are the reptiles, birds, and animals. And so what is an amniote? An amniote is going to be an organism that has an egg with an amniotic sac, like a covering that basically keeps it from drying out. So this includes the reptiles, which include, notice the archosaurs, which included the crocodiles. Get a little bit more specific, now we have the dinosaurs branching off of that. And then the Saurischians, which then led to the birds. So this includes birds and then our other groups of reptiles. Turtles are kind of interesting. We don't know where to quite put them because they kind of got a different skull structure. They got a couple other things going on. Some scientists, I think, do have them branching off as part of the archosaurs. All right, they're reptiles, but man, they're so different than a lot of the other reptiles that we have today. They kind of get their own group. Notice that the snakes and lizards are way over here, and that they're even more closely related to this other type of reptile called a tuatara, and there's only a few of them. They're native to New Zealand. So they're closely related, and then the turtles are way out here, like basically with these other reptile type things. These are called para-reptiles. In other words, like they're pretty close to reptiles, but these are like the really primitive ones that have been extinct for hundreds of millions of years. And so turtles are just kind of throwbacks to that. Now notice we got this group here called synapsids, and this is where I was talking about. We have what are called anapsids, which basically they don't have a hole in the skull for biting down, like your fish. Then we have what are called diapsids and synapsids. Synapsids have this hole, we call it the zygomatic arch, where a muscle goes down and wraps around the jaw and basically allows us to take and have more bite force. Reptiles have another hole, which basically gives them another muscle attachment to move through and gives them a better bite. Now, turtles don't have that, and that's why these turtles are like way out here. But then all these other guys over here are considered your diapsids. So amniotes are named for a major derived characteristic, basically the amniotic egg. And us, we retain it as the amniotic sac. The chorion is another covering that's outside the amnion. You may learn about that if you take an anatomy and physiology course. But basically, this chorion is this outer covering that's thicker. It's like inside the egg, like the membrane inside the egg. And then you have the amnion that's inside that kind of just holds the amniotic fluid, basically the egg white, which is amniotic fluid and when we look at humans. And then the yolk sac and allantois. Yolk sac provides nutrients. The allantois takes away those nutrients, the waste. And you might say, well, we don't have a yolk sac or an allantois. Well, yeah, actually we do, but it fuses together into this long tube, which we call the umbilical cord. So here you can see, here's the yolk, provides nutrients. Here's the allantois, get rid of that waste. And together they fuse and become the umbilical cord, and you can see it right there. It's going right into the belly button of this. Well, this is a chicken. All right, so here we have the chorion surrounding this amnion. So here's the amniotic cavity. The amniotic egg was a key adaptation for life on land. Basically, frogs, they don't have this, and so their eggs can dry out. Like, their eggs have to stay moist. They got to stay really close to water. These guys could lay eggs, like some reptiles can lay their eggs out in the desert. So there you go. Now, in the case of mammals, we carry our eggs with us inside the uterus in basically what is the placenta, and then the chorion and the amnion inside the womb. So amniotes have other terrestrial adaptations, such as relatively impermeable skin. Basically, our skin doesn't dry out like amphibians. And the ability to use the rib cage to ventilate the lungs. By expanding the rib cage, we can breathe. It's a little different. In mammalian, we have a bigger advantage, which is called the diaphragm, but that's in a bit. So the reptile clade includes the tuataras. They look like lizards. They're found in New Zealand. You got some different characteristics. So some a little bit more primitive. Lizards, snakes. Now, I mentioned turtles before. They're way out there. Like, they're less related to all the other ones even than the crocodiles. Crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to lizards and snakes. And some other extinct groups, like, for example, the dinosaurs. Reptiles have scales that create a waterproof barrier. Most reptiles lay shelled eggs on land. It can be a softer shell, but it is considered a shell. Notice they don't even put birds on here separately because they consider them part of the group of the reptiles having descended from the dinosaurs. Most reptiles are ectothermic, meaning the outside temperature controls their body temperature. Now, again, an exception to that are the birds. So their outside body temperature helps regulate their body temperature. That's why a lot of them bathe in the sun. Ectotherms regulate their body temperature through behavioral adaptation. So again, bathing in the sun. I mentioned that ectothermic, the outside determines their body temperature. Well, we sometimes call it cold-blooded. Endothermic is what we typically and commonly call warm-blooded. So capable of maintaining body temperature through metabolism. And we do see some reptiles that kind of have some almost like warm-bloodedness, but not exactly. Some of those traits, but particularly like the birds. The birds are warm-blooded. So, all right, birds are archosaurs. One of the groups of reptiles, but almost every feature of the reptilian anatomy has undergone modification, and that's why we do consider them in a lot of classification schemes as their own order. Like we give them their own order, the aves or avians, which means bird, right? And it's because of their ability to fly. So basically, their wings have keratin-type feathers. The feathers allow them, again, to fly. It goes along with the adaptation of the wings. They have these special joints in their wings that allow them to basically flap them, that allow them to fly. Other adaptations include a lack of a urinary bladder. Can't fly on with a full bladder, so they basically have lost that. And then instead of producing urine, they put it. Their urine is a uric acid rather than urea, and then it's put into their poop, which is the white part of the poop. Is basically bird pee. Females only have one ovary, again reducing their weight, small gonads, loss of teeth. All these are other characteristics that birds have basically developed over time. Here we have their hollow bones. Again, hollow bones basically make them lighter, again for flight. Birds probably descended from small theropods, particularly groups related to Deinonychus, which is a primitive velociraptor, which is a group of carnivorous dinosaurs. And they trace that back again to, I mentioned they had this pivot bone in their wrists that allowed them to flap their wings, and we see that in that group of theropods. So early feathers might have evolved for insulation, camouflage, or courtship display. Turns out a lot more dinosaurs had feathers than what we had realized even a decade or two ago. So it's pretty well accepted that many dinosaurs had feathers rather than just a few. Going back like 30, 40 years ago, that was the assumption that basically you didn't see feathers at all. You even look at like the first Jurassic Park movies, and there's very, very few feathered dinosaurs. And as they progress through that series, they start showing it more and more. By the third Jurassic Park, they start making the velociraptors, they start stylizing them with more feathers. And that just shows how scientific discovery influenced culture. All right, so anyways, so several groups of birds are flightless. The ratites or order Strathiformes, penguins, certain species of rails, ducks, pigeons. So the ratites are like, for example, this large emu here. There's your penguin. So the demands of flight have rendered the general body form of many flying birds similar to one another. By the way, there's a lot more interesting things about birds as far as their adaptations. Like, for example, even their lungs are kind of like analogous to like bagpipes, that they constantly have air flying through them. They have really high metabolisms. There's some really interesting things to study with birds, but again, beyond the scope of this class. So bird species can be distinguished by characters including profile, color, flying style, behavior, beak shape, foot structure. So those are all things that ornithologists look at to classify them. All right, and then that brings us to the mammals. So class Mammalia are represented by 5,300 species, give or take, depending on the scientists doing the classification. So mammals, they have to have mammary glands, which produce milk. They have to have hair. Now, the hair can be greatly reduced, like in the case of whales, but it's there. They do have hair. A high metabolic rate due to endothermy, so basically all of them are endothermic or warm-blooded, and a larger brain than other vertebrates of equivalent size. And another important thing is the differentiated teeth. We are what are called heterodonts, where most of the other things are homodonts. I mean, if you think of like a shark, all the teeth are pretty much the same. Think of an alligator or a crocodile. Again, all the teeth are pretty much the same. But when we look at mammals, we have different groups of teeth. You know, your incisors and your cuspids, bicuspids, and then your molars. All those are different, and then different animals modify those depending on whether they're chewing food, grinding food. I mean, even between a mammoth and a mastodon, there's a difference in their molars based on whether they were eating just grass or eating like more like a woody type diet where they're eating more like the bark and twigs of the undergrowth and such. And so that's one of the characteristics that they can use to determine if a fossilized species was a mammoth or a mastodon. Mammals are synapsids, meaning we only got that one extra hole for the biting down. And that's how that's one of the ways we tie all the mammals together. By the way, there are some mammal-like reptiles that were synapsids early on, like for example, Dimetrodon. Again, beyond the scope of this class, but there are what were known as mammal-like reptiles back in the fossil record. So an evolution of mammals from early synapsids, two bones that formerly made up the jaw joint were incorporated into the mammalian inner ear. So only mammals had an inner ear, which magnifies sound quite a bit and gives us a hearing advantage. So we can see these bones right here, which eventually become the malleus, which is basically hammer, the incus, which is the anvil, and the stapes, which is the stirrup. So these three bones here we see, where you only see this one bone in present-day reptiles. So the membrane vibrates, shaking this one bone. Here, the membrane shakes the eardrum, and it shakes three bones, which magnifies the sound and gives mammals an exceptional sense of hearing. By the early Cretaceous, three lineages of mammals were recognized. Monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals, only two of them are left, the spiny echidna, or spiny anteater, and the platypus. Now, I said two of them were left, but understand the echidna, sometimes some scientists classify them into 1, 2, or even 4 different species. So there's a couple of them. And the eutherians, which are basically your placentals, that's us. So mammals did not undergo significant adaptive radiation until the late Cretaceous. It's my alarm telling me I need to speed this up. All right. So mammals did not undergo a significant adaptive radiation until after the Cretaceous, which the Cretaceous was the last period of the dinosaurs. So basically, dinosaurs had to get out of our way. So monotremes, they're the egg layers. There's your echidna. You can see a picture of the egg there. Marsupials include opossums, kangaroos, and koalas. So marsupials have a marsupium, or this pouch. Basically, they give birth to a small embryo, just a couple weeks old. It crawls up, finds its way into that pouch, where it finds the nipple, attaches to it, and then grows and then stays there for the first couple of years of life. So born very early in development. So it does have a placenta, but it's a very small placental period. Completes its embryonic development. Basically, it's still an embryo when it gets into the mother's marsupium. So there you go. That's about the size of a grain of rice, and that's what's attaching to the nipple and feeding inside the marsupium. And marsupials have a lot of convergent evolution. There's a lot of them that look very similar to a lot of animals that we have today, but a lot of mammals. I said we have the marsupials today, but these guys are all basically found in Australia. These are found in the rest of the world. And so that's back to that convergent evolution we talked about earlier in the course. So compared with marsupials, eutherians have a more complex placenta. They basically, the kids stick around a lot longer in the uterus before they get evicted and live their life externally. Some are born very, very ready for life. Like, for example, giraffes, within an hour, they're running or they're lion food. Now, again, that varies. I mean, humans, we take 18 years before the kids grow up, and even then I sometimes debate that maybe it's till their 30s. But really, yeah, we do take a lot longer to develop. Newborn humans are much more reliant on their parents, but part of that has to do with our brain. If our brains got any larger before we got evicted from the womb, we wouldn't be able to, get out of the womb. And humans are one of the only animals that really need help. I mean, we really need help for birth, which is why, medicine today that's why there's a whole branch of pediatrics that involves, just child labor. So molecular and morphological data give conflicting dates about diversification of the eutherians, basically trying to decide, how do all these guys fit together and where do they branch off. Next couple slides just talk about some of the groups of mammals and then actually some of the traits overall. Go ahead and take your time and look through these and be familiar with some of the characteristics. Nothing too specific is going to be on the test, but again, look through it, be familiar with it for your quiz. So here are our monotremes and our marsupials. Here are some of the orders of the mammals. There are your eutherians. And then here you can see this chart does a real good job of breaking down the derived characteristics of each group. And notice that, a lot of times we think that these are separate branches and that they aren't inclusive, but really this includes all of these animals. Now, these two basal ones don't have the rest of these traits, which are basically the Hox, gene duplication, backbone. And so all of these guys fit into that. So all of these guys are grouped together as one large group. So it's this novel trait is developed and it's passed on to basically all the rest of the ancestors in that group. All right, and that's everything for today.